The auction barn smelled of hay and old wood, that sweet mix of dust and time that clings to places where stories hide. People shuffled in and out, their chatter soft and curious, waiting for the next lot to be announced. No one expected much from the animal that stepped in then, its hooves dragging lightly against the floorboards, its head lowered with the weight of years. It was a horse that looked tired, too thin to fight against the halter rope, too weary to carry pride in its stride. The crowd hushed as it entered, not out of awe but out of pity. Its coat was faded, patchy in places, and its back sagged under, the shadow of a saddle that seemed far too heavy for it. A lame horse had no place in an auction where speed and strength usually determined worth, and yet here it was, moving into the center like a forgotten relic. The auctioneer cleared his throat, trying to keep the rhythm of the event alive, but even his voice softened as he introduced the animal. The horse's eyes told a story no words could carry, eyes that held both loss and quiet defiance. People whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads, others pressing lips together as though the sight cut deeper than they expected. For a moment it felt as though time slowed, the barn holding its breath to see what would happen next. The horse flicked an ear at the sound of murmurs as if it knew it was being judged, not for what it could become but for what it had already lost. Still, there was something else about it. Something hidden. The saddle sat stiffly across its back, buckled in place as though guarding a secret. Its leather straps were worn but secure, and though the animal stumbled slightly on its front leg, it carried the weight with strange patience. Observers noticed the oddness but didn't speak it aloud. In silent auctions, words were scarce anyway. Bids were cast with glances, gestures, and cards lifted half-heartedly. But here, the silence grew thick, for another reason. Curiosity lingered, hovering around the saddle, around what might be unseen. A child in the back tugged at a parent's sleeve, asking why a horse like that would even be here. The parent didn't answer. Some people looked away as though ashamed to see an animal so fragile paraded for sale, while others leaned forward, sensing that maybe, just maybe, there was more to this moment than an old horse standing under dim light. The air carried a tension that made hearts beat faster, though no one quite understood why. The handler gave the rope a soft pull, guiding the horse forward. Each step echoed unevenly across the barn floor, the sound of weight shifting awkwardly, of bones that had endured too much. And yet, beneath the sorrow there was dignity, the kind of dignity that can only come from survival. This horse had seen storms. It had traveled roads longer than most could imagine. It had carried burdens and secrets alike. People didn't know it yet, but they were staring at a story far bigger than the auction itself. When the bids began, they were hesitant. A number flashed here, another there, not out of true desire, but out of sympathy. No one thought the horse was worth much. But then, someone close to the front raised a hand, eyes fixed not on the animal's limp but on the saddle. Others noticed too. There was something unusual, something too deliberate in the way it was fastened. Whispers traveled again, more urgent this time. Why hadn't the saddle been removed before the auction? Why was it still strapped down so tightly? The horse shifted its weight, and the leather creaked. A sharp sound rang out in the silence, drawing every eye to the straps. For the first time that day, the animal lifted its head a little higher, nostrils flaring as if it too knew what everyone was beginning to suspect. It wasn't just a horse standing in front of them. It was a vessel carrying something more. Something waiting to be discovered. The handler hesitated, sensing the crowd's growing unease. Finally, with a deep breath, he reached toward the buckle. Fingers shook slightly as they fumbled with the leather. The barn so quiet now that even the horses in the back stalls stilled their movements. Each tug on the strap felt heavier than the last, like peeling away layers of silence that had been building for years. People leaned in. Some held their breath. Others clutched their bidding cards tightly, no longer thinking about numbers, but about what was about to be revealed. The moment stretched long, a fragile string about to snap. The horse stood motionless, its lame leg planted firmly, its eyes glimmering with something no one could quite name. And then, with one final pull, the buckle loosened. The saddle shifted slightly to the side, just enough to show that there was something underneath. Not just padding or cloth, but something else. Something tucked away with purpose. The crowd gasped as the first glimpse of it appeared, a corner of mystery peeking from the shadows. Tears welled in more than a few eyes before the truth even fully showed itself. It was not just about an old horse anymore. It was about what it carried, about the weight it bore in silence all this time. The handler froze, his hand hovering, unwilling to lift the saddle all at once. The barn trembled with anticipation, every heartbeat sinking to the stillness of that moment. What lay hidden under the leather was not yet clear, but everyone knew it would change the way they looked at this broken animal forever. The lame horse had walked into the silent auction unnoticed, unwanted, almost forgotten. But what was discovered, beneath its saddle, was about to rewrite everything, and that was when the tears began to fall, even before the secret fully came into view. The horse had carried more than pain, more than scars. It had carried something that belonged to every person watching, something that reached deep inside them, stirring memories and hopes they didn't realize they still carried. The crowd leaned closer, desperate to see, desperate to know. The saddle was halfway off now, and the truth beneath it was just about to be revealed. The room held its breath, suspended in that fragile place between sorrow and revelation, waiting for the moment when the burden would finally be lifted and the story hidden all this time would step into the light. The saddle hung loosely now, its straps dangling at awkward angles, and yet no one dared to rush forward. The weight of curiosity pressed heavier than the wood beams above their heads. The horse flicked its tail once as though it could feel every eye fixed upon it. Its chest rose and fell with slow breaths, carrying a calmness that only deepened the tension around it. The handler's hand hovered, almost trembling, his body caught between duty and dread. He knew that whatever was uncovered would not simply be forgotten. It would cling to the people in this room the way dust clung to the rafters. The crowd stood still, locked in that moment, but behind their silence lived questions. Who had brought this animal here? Why had it been allowed to enter the silent auction in such a state? And most of all, what was so carefully hidden beneath that leather saddle? These questions swirled without answers, filling the air with unease. The truth was still buried, but the shadow of it reached them all, making hearts pound harder with every second of delay. At the far side of the barn, a woman with folded arms studied the horse more closely than anyone else. She had seen animals, come and go through auctions for years, but never one like this. Something in its posture felt different, something that whispered of secrets stitched into its very skin. She remembered the way the animal had entered the barn, its limp obvious, but its presence strangely commanding. She found herself leaning forward, her eyes never leaving the bulge under the saddle blanket that had caused so many gasps. Others in the barn whispered quietly, their voices brushing against the silence like fragile wings. Some speculated it was nothing more than an old trick, a way to draw attention to a horse that otherwise wouldn't fetch a bid. But their voices lacked conviction. Deep down, they knew this was different. The stillness of the horse, the weight of the atmosphere, the way the handler hesitated, it all pointed to something much heavier than a simple trick. The horse lowered its head and gave a soft shake, as though trying to remind them that it had carried this burden long before any of them laid eyes on it. The sound of its breathing was steady, but each rise of its ribcage seemed to carry the memory of long journeys and silent struggles. It wasn't just an animal on a wooden floor, it was a witness to something untold. The handler finally let out a breath he had been holding and pressed his palm against the saddle, steadying himself. He had seen his share of auctions, but never had he felt such weight pressing on his chest. He could feel the crowd behind him, waiting, expecting, yet he hesitated again. To reveal what lay beneath meant pulling back more than leather. It meant tearing open something hidden for reasons no one yet understood. In the back row, an older man shifted his weight, his walking stick tapping lightly against the floor. His face was lined with years of hard labor, but his eyes were sharp, studying the horse with intent. He knew the look of an animal that had been worked beyond its strength. He also knew the signs of something guarded, of secrets tucked where no one was supposed to find them. The way the saddle had been secured so tightly was not normal. It wasn't the work of someone careless. It was deliberate, careful, as if protecting something fragile from the eyes of the world. As the murmur spread through the crowd, the air grew heavy with a strange blend of pity and anticipation. People weren't sure if they wanted to know the truth or if they feared it. The horse shifted again, and with that small movement, the saddle slid further, exposing just enough to show that there was indeed something hidden beneath the blanket. The faint outline of it pressed upward against the fabric, undeniable now. The handler froze once more, and gasps rippled through the barn like a wave. For years, auctions had been places of bargains, where stories were ignored in favor of prices, where creatures were measured in strength and speed. Yet in that moment, it was not the value of the horse that mattered. It was the story it carried on its back, a story that demanded to be uncovered. People leaned closer, their breaths mixing in the cold air, their eyes wide with both dread and hope. The horse's eyes glistened in the dim light, catching shadows like mirrors of sorrow. It did not resist, did not pull against the rope, but stood still as if it had been waiting for this moment, as if it knew that what had been hidden too long was finally ready to surface. Every heart in that barn felt the pull of that truth, even without knowing it fully. The handler glanced back at the auctioneer, but no words were spoken. The man at the podium simply gave a nod, his own voice caught in his throat. The rules of the auction seemed meaningless now. The bids had faded into silence, and what mattered was not who would pay, but what would be revealed. Slowly, the handler's fingers moved again, pulling at the leather, lifting the heavy saddle a little higher. The blanket shifted with it, and something slipped into view, just enough for those closest to catch a glimpse. A hush fell so deep it was almost painful. The shape was there, unexpected and unmistakable, pressing against the woolen fabric like a ghost trying to push through. People in the crowd held their breath. Some reached for the hands of those beside them without realizing it, needing to steady themselves. The old man with the walking stick leaned forward, his knuckles whitening around the handle as his eyes widened. He knew then that this moment was not about a horse being sold. It was about something long buried finally being uncovered. The handler's hands paused again, his voice breaking into the silence, low and unsteady. "It's not just a horse," he said, barely loud enough to reach the ears of those in the front. His words traveled anyway, carried by the silence itself, reaching the back rows like a whisper that shook the entire room. No one knew what he meant yet, but they felt it. The truth lay inches away, beneath worn leather and faded cloth. And yet, the saddle wasn't lifted completely. Not yet. The mystery remained in place, heavy and unresolved, and the crowd trembled with the weight of it. Outside, the wind rattled the barn doors, a reminder that the world beyond was still moving, unaware of the storm gathering inside. But those within the wooden walls knew they were standing at the edge of something unforgettable. The lame horse had walked into the silent auction carrying more than scars, and now that burden was about to change every life in the room. Still, the handler's hands froze, unwilling to take the final step. His breath hitched, his chest rising and falling with visible struggle. He could not bring himself to reveal it fully, not yet. The crowd pressed closer, desperate and afraid, knowing the truth was seconds away, but trapped in the unbearable pause that held them all captive. The horse turned its head then, meeting the eyes of the woman who had been watching so closely. For a fleeting second, it felt as though the animal was asking for understanding, asking her to be ready for what came next. Her chest tightened, her throat dry, but she did not look away. She knew deep in her bones that when the saddle was finally removed, the world inside that barn would not be the same again. And so the moment lingered, fragile and sharp. The truth waited under layers of leather and cloth, but still hidden. Suspense hung over them like a storm cloud about to break. No one moved. No one dared. The lame horse stood still, a silent keeper of a secret that none of them could yet name, and the mystery beneath its saddle threatened to spill into their lives with a force none of them were prepared for. The saddle finally shifted far enough that the blanket beneath it slipped, revealing more of the shape that had been pressed against the horse's back. It wasn't just fabric or stuffing, and it wasn't some ordinary trick to spark attention. The crowd leaned forward as one, their breaths shallow, hearts drumming against ribs like restless hooves on the barn floor. What was tucked away there looked deliberate, purposeful, and it made the silence inside that auction hall unbearable. The handler froze, sweat beading at his brow despite the chill of the air. His fingers trembled against the leather as if he was holding back a flood with nothing more than a fragile dam. He could feel every eye on him, pressing him to go further, to peel away the last barrier and show what had been hidden. But the weight of responsibility pulled at his arms, made his chest tighten. Whatever was revealed would not just change the fate of the horse. It would ripple through everyone watching, altering the course of lives in ways none of them could yet imagine. From the corner, the older man with the walking stick spoke up, his voice gravelly but steady. "Don't rush it," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "Some truths come slow." His words carried across the room, planting a seed of unease. Was the crowd truly ready for what was there? Could they handle the truth without breaking under it? The woman who had been watching closely swallowed hard, her throat dry as dust. She felt a pull in her chest she couldn't explain, as if she shared a bond with the animal she had never met before that day. The horse's eyes had locked on hers, and something about that look unsettled her. It wasn't just the pain of an old lame creature. It was the look of something carrying a burden for too long, waiting for someone else to share it. The auctioneer stood stiffly at the podium, his usual rhythm of patter and call gone completely. His cards lay forgotten, his gavel unused. This was no longer about bids. He could feel it too. The energy in the barn had shifted into something darker, something that pulsed beneath the surface like a heartbeat no one wanted to name. He watched the handler hesitate and wondered if he would even have the strength to finish the task. Then came the murmur of doubt. A man near the back folded his arms and shook his head. "It's a trick," he whispered to those beside him. "They're staging this, trying to pull at our emotions." But even as he said it, his voice lacked conviction. He could see the truth in the way the handler's hands shook, in the way the horse remained eerily still, in the way tears welled uninvited in the eyes of strangers who had no reason to feel anything at all. The conflict began to stir not just in the barn, but inside the people gathered there. Some were desperate to see the truth, to rip the saddle free and satisfy their hunger for answers. Others feared it, afraid of what it might mean, afraid that once seen, it could never be unseen. The barn became a place divided yet still bound together by the single presence of a horse that had carried more than anyone could have guessed. The woman's mind drifted to the stories she'd heard over the years, tales of horses carrying messages during desperate times, of animals burdened with secrets their owners could not bear to hold. She remembered her own childhood, her father telling her that horses never forgot, that their backs carried not only riders, but the memories of every mile, every moment, every sorrow. What if this horse was proof of that? What if what lay beneath that saddle was more than a forgotten relic? It was a piece of a story meant to be remembered. The old man with the walking stick tightened his grip, his thoughts racing back decades. He had once known a horse with eyes just like this one. Strong, noble yet haunted. That animal had disappeared one night, taken under circumstances that had never been explained. He wondered now if fate had brought him here, to this auction, to witness the truth finally surface. The thought sent a shiver through his bones. Outside, the wind grew harsher, rattling the barn's wooden frame. The horses in the nearby stalls stirred uneasily, sensing the tension of the humans around them. Animals always knew. They could feel when fear gripped a room, when hearts beat too fast, when something hidden was about to break loose. The lame horse at the center flicked an ear and shifted slightly, as though readying itself for what was coming. The handler licked his lips, finally tugging the saddle further to one side. The blanket slid down, and more of the hidden object revealed itself. Gasps filled the room again. It wasn't a trick. The shape was too real, too solid. Something wrapped, something concealed, pressed tight against the horse's back for who knew how long. The crowd drew in closer, eyes wide, their own stories and fears mingling with the mystery before them. And yet the handler still hesitated. He stepped back, shaking his head. "I can't," he muttered under his breath. His voice cracked, and those nearest could hear the raw fear in it. He felt as though he was standing on the edge of something sacred, something too heavy for one man to uncover alone. The woman took a step forward, her heart pounding against her ribs. She didn't know why, but she felt called to move, as if the horse itself had asked her. The animal's gaze followed her as she came closer, the rope between its halter and the handler slackening slightly. The handler didn't stop her. His shoulders sagged with relief as though he had been waiting for someone else to share the weight. The crowd held their breath as she reached for the saddle. Her hands shook, but not from fear. At least, not entirely. It was something deeper. The awareness that she was touching a story that wasn't hers. A truth that had been buried too long. She slid her fingers under the leather, lifting, feeling the strain in her arms. The blanket fell further away, and what was hidden beneath came into sharper view. She froze, not because she didn't want to finish, but because what she saw was enough to shake her to her core. The outline was undeniable now, and tears pricked her eyes before she even fully understood why. She glanced at the handler, at the old man, at the auctioneer. None of them moved. None of them spoke. The entire barn was caught in the web of suspense, unable to free themselves from it. Still, she didn't lift the saddle completely. She pulled back, her hands trembling as she stepped away. She couldn't do it. Not yet. The weight of what lay beneath was too much for one moment. The truth would have to come slowly, piece by piece, the way a wound reveals itself when finally unbandaged. The crowd erupted into whispers again, torn between impatience and dread. Some wanted to demand answers, to rip away the last of the covering and finally see what had been hidden. Others feared what it would mean. What kind of story could be carried so secretly on the back of a broken horse? The air buzzed with conflict, not just about the object itself, but about the lives it would touch once revealed. The old man's eyes glistened as he muttered to himself, "It can't be, after all these years." His words were soft, but those near him turned sharply, their faces pale. What did he know? What memory did this stir in him that made his voice shake with both awe and fear? The auctioneer gripped the edge of his podium, his knuckles white. He realized then that this auction was no longer his to control. Whatever happened next belonged to the horse, to the mystery, and to the people bound together by this strange and unsettling moment, and so the conflict deepened, stretching beyond the barn. It was no longer just about a lame horse or an odd saddle. It was about secrets carried across years, about truths that refused to stay buried. It was about the people gathered there, each of them drawn into a story they hadn't expected to witness but could no longer walk away from. The horse shifted again, its eyes calm yet commanding. It stood as the center of the storm, the silent bearer of something that demanded to be known but still refused to be fully revealed. And the crowd, restless and divided, waited with hearts heavy and breaths uneven, knowing that the moment of truth was still out there, hovering just beyond their reach, refusing to let them go. The barn seemed to shrink with every passing second, the walls closing in as if the weight of the secret pressed down on the very structure. People who had come expecting an ordinary evening of quiet bidding now stood shoulder to shoulder, their hearts caught in a storm they couldn't see, but could feel in their bones. The lame horse stood at the center of it all, still and silent, its head lowered just slightly as if bracing itself for the burden to finally be lifted. Its breath came slow and steady, but its eyes shimmered with something that felt almost human: patience, sorrow, and a depth no one could ignore. The saddle was nearly off now, yet the final straps clung stubbornly as though they too were unwilling to release what had been bound so tightly. The handler's hands shook, his face pale, and still he could not take that last step. The woman who had tried before stood a few feet away, her chest rising and falling in uneven waves. She wanted to go back, to finish what she had started, but something inside her held her frozen. The crowd's anticipation was crushing. Their whispers had turned into silence again. the kind of silence that throbbed with fear and wonder all at once. The old man with the walking stick leaned harder on his cane, his knuckles white with the strain. His eyes had not left the horse, and though he did not speak, the tremor in his jaw revealed that he knew more than he let on. The woman caught sight of him, saw the way his lips pressed tightly together, and it struck her that whatever was hidden under that saddle had ties to more than just the horse. It was tied to him, to her, maybe to everyone who stood in that barn without even realizing it. The auctioneer's gavel lay useless on the podium. He had tried to maintain control of the auction, but now his hands gripped the wood like a man, clinging to the edge of a cliff. He had never seen anything like this before. Auctions were supposed to be predictable, mundane even. But here, in the presence of this broken horse, the air itself seemed charged with a power beyond his understanding. The tension fractured suddenly when a man from the back pushed forward, his boots thudding against the wooden floor. His voice cut through the stillness. "Enough of this nonsense," he barked. "It's just an animal. Take off the saddle and be done with it." His tone was harsh, impatient, yet beneath it lay a quiver of unease. He wasn't immune to the weight of the moment. He was simply trying to fight it with bravado. Several heads turned toward him, but no one moved to agree or disagree. The horse flicked its ear at the sound, but otherwise stood motionless, as if refusing to be rushed. The woman's heart pounded harder. She wanted to tell the man to stop, to let the truth reveal itself in its own time, but the words caught in her throat. She looked back at the horse and felt a strange certainty that this animal was not here by accident. It had come into this auction for a reason, carrying its secret like a message meant for the right hands. The handler stepped back finally, his courage gone, his eyes wide with a fear he couldn't mask. The old man took a step forward, then slowly, leaning heavily on his cane. His voice, though weak with age, carried across the barn. "This is not just about the horse," he said. "This is about what was hidden, and why it was hidden." His words sent a chill through the room. People glanced at one another nervously. What did he mean? Did he know? The woman's breath caught. Her instincts told her the old man had been waiting for this moment far longer than anyone else. His hands shook, not just from age but from memory, from something in his past colliding with the present. He looked at the horse the way someone looks at an old friend, recognition mixed with sorrow. The handler glanced at him, torn between fear and hope, and stepped aside, silently giving permission for the old man to take his place. The old man's hand reached out, trembling but steady enough to grasp the last strap of the saddle. The room tightened around him, people leaning in, unable to blink for fear of missing what would come next. He tugged slowly, every movement deliberate, the leather groaning in protest. The crowd's breaths aligned, rising and falling together like one enormous heartbeat. The horse shifted slightly but did not resist. It seemed to know that this was the moment it had been waiting for. The woman's mind raced as she watched. What was so important that someone had strapped it to a horse's back and sent it into the world like this? What kind of burden was heavy, enough to be hidden away but important enough to be carried in silence? She could feel the tension in her fingertips, her palms sweating though the barn was cold. Her entire body leaned forward unconsciously, her spirit reaching for the truth. The crowd's whispers began to swell again, a nervous hum. Some muttered prayers under their breath. Others shook their heads, trying to convince themselves it was nothing. But no one moved to leave. Every single soul in that barn was bound to the mystery now, unable to break free until the saddle was lifted. The old man's voice broke the silence again, softer this time, as though speaking more to himself. All these years, and it comes back like this. His eyes glistened, his jaw clenched. The woman heard him and felt her stomach twist. Whatever was hidden under that saddle, it was not just a secret. It was a story he had lived, and maybe one the rest of them were about to inherit. The saddle slipped further, the last buckle nearly undone. The blanket sagged, and the outline beneath became clearer. The gasps came again, louder this time, spreading through the crowd like a wave. People covered their mouths, eyes wide, hearts pounding harder. They could see enough now to know it wasn't ordinary. It wasn't something that belonged on the back of a horse at an auction. It was something that carried weight. Something that demanded to be remembered. The woman took another step forward, her legs trembling. She wanted to reach out, to help, but she also feared what her eyes might see if she did. She could feel the conflict inside her tearing her in two. Desire for the truth on one side, terror of it on the other. The horse turned its head slightly, its eyes meeting hers once again, and for the briefest moment she felt it speak without words. Be ready. The barn doors rattled violently as the wind outside picked up, slamming against the frame. Dust swirled in the air, catching in the light, making the moment feel almost otherworldly. The horses in the stalls whinnied uneasily, their hooves shuffling against the floor. Even the earth beneath them seemed to tremble with anticipation. The man in the back who had shouted earlier stepped closer again, his impatience rising. "Show it already," he demanded, his voice cracking. But his eyes betrayed him. He wanted to know as much as anyone else, but fear laced his words. The crowd hissed at him, their nerves stretched so thin they couldn't bear his interruption. The old man ignored him, his hand steady now as he worked at the last buckle. His face was pale, sweat shining at his temples, but he pressed on, determined. The handler stood rigid beside him, the woman hovering near, and the auctioneer clutched his podium as though bracing for impact. The air grew heavy, pressing down on every chest in the barn. The last buckle loosened. The saddle shifted again, teetering on the edge of falling. The blanket sagged low, the hidden object nearly visible in full. The crowd gasped once more, louder than before, and the barn filled with the sound of pounding hearts and trembling breaths. The horse lifted its head high then, taller than it had all evening, its eyes bright and commanding. It stood proud despite its limp, as if declaring that this moment belonged to it. The lame horse that had entered the silent auction unwanted, forgotten, now stood as the center of everything. Its secret was seconds from being revealed, and every soul in that room knew they were standing at the edge of something life-altering. And still the saddle clung, hanging by the last threads of leather in silence. The old man took one more breath, his hand trembling, his eyes wet with memories no one else could see. The woman held hers, her chest tight, her entire being leaning toward the truth that waited. The crowd pressed in, their whispers gone, their voices stolen by suspense so sharp it cut the air. The moment teetered there, fragile and unbearable, the truth ready to break free, yet still hidden in the shadows of leather and cloth. The barn itself seemed to tremble as if it too held its breath, waiting for the final step that would tear away the silence forever. The climax was close, so close that the weight of it pressed on every heart, leaving them trembling in the dark. The saddle finally gave way, falling heavily to the ground with a thud that echoed through the barn. The blanket slid aside and the truth was laid bare before the crowd. What had been hidden for so long was no longer concealed. Gasps rippled through the air, sharper than any cry, as every pair of eyes locked on the object strapped to the horse's back. It was a small chest, weathered with age, its wooden surface scarred but still strong. The straps had held it in place for countless miles, pressed against the animal's spine as though the horse itself had been chosen to guard it. The chest bore markings carved deep into its surface, patterns that spoke of hands long gone, of a story etched in secrecy. The crowd edged closer, drawn as though by an invisible tether, hearts pounding with the knowledge that this moment would change everything. The old man let his cane fall to the ground, his trembling hand reaching for the chest. Tears welled in his eyes, not from the strain of age, but from memory. He traced the carvings with his fingertips, his lips parting in recognition. "I know this," he whispered. His voice shook, yet it carried enough strength to reach the farthest corners of the barn. "I thought it was gone forever." The woman stepped closer, her breath shallow, her heart trembling with every beat. She looked at the chest, then at the horse, and a strange understanding settled inside her. This wasn't just an accident. This horse had been carrying something precious, something too important to leave to fate. It had been led here, to this auction, to be seen, to be revealed. The auctioneer's face was pale, his gavel forgotten. He no longer cared for bids or numbers. The story unfolding before him was far greater than any sale he could conduct. The crowd, once divided between impatience and fear, now leaned forward in quiet unity. They knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. The handler bent down, unfastening the last of the straps that held the chest in place. His hand shook, not from effort, but from the weight of responsibility. When the chest was finally free, he placed it carefully on the ground before the old man. The horse let out a soft sigh, a sound that seemed almost like relief. For the first time that night, its burden was gone. The old man knelt before the chest, his cane forgotten on the floor beside him. He touched the lid with reverence, his voice low. "This belonged to my brother," he said, his eyes distant, looking into a past only he could see. "He disappeared during the war. We thought he never came home. But this..." His hand shook as he opened the chest. Inside lay letters, folded and yellowed with time. Each bore the mark of careful handwriting, sealed with wax that had cracked with age. Beneath them lay trinkets, tokens of a life carried across distance and loss. The old man lifted one letter and pressed it to his chest, his shoulders shaking with sobs. "He wanted us to know," he whispered. "He wanted his story to live." The crowd stood in silence, their hearts breaking and healing all at once. They had come for a silent auction, but they had found a story of love, loss, and endurance. The woman felt tears slide down her cheeks. She didn't know the man's brother, but she could feel the weight of his sacrifice, the years carried on the back of this horse. She reached out, resting her hand lightly on the horse's neck. "You brought him home," she murmured. The animal's eyes met hers, soft and knowing, as if it understood. The impatient man who had shouted earlier now stood silent, his face pale. His arms hung at his sides, his bravado gone. Even he could not deny the truth of what they had witnessed. He lowered his head, ashamed of his harsh words. The letters were passed gently among the crowd, each person holding them with care, reading fragments of a story written in ink, but carried in flesh and bone. The words spoke of hope, of family, of dreams for peace. They were the kind of words meant to be read, meant to be remembered, not hidden away in the dark. The old man lifted his eyes, tears streaming freely. "This horse carried my brother's memory across the years. It carried him back to me." His voice cracked, but his words burned with truth. He reached for the woman's hand, his grip weak but steady. "You helped bring it to light. Thank you." The handler stepped back, his eyes wet. He had thought himself only a caretaker of a tired, lame horse, but now he understood that he had been a guardian of something far greater. His respect for the animal deepened, his heart humbled by the trust it had shown. The auctioneer, still at his podium, finally spoke. His voice was soft, reverent. "There will be no sale tonight. Some things are beyond value." He lowered his gavel, no longer a tool of business but a symbol of finality. The crowd murmured in agreement, no one daring to object. The woman stroked the horse's mane, her heart heavy yet full. She thought of the journeys it must have taken, the weight it had borne without complaint. She thought of the way it had stood so still, waiting for the truth to be uncovered. She knew she would never forget this night, nor the look in the horse's eyes when its burden was finally lifted. The old man gathered the chest in his arms, cradling it as though it were his brother himself. The horse lowered its head to him, and for a moment man and animal shared something deeper than words. The old man pressed his forehead to the horse's muzzle, whispering softly, "You carried him back to me. You carried him home." The barn was filled with a quiet peace now, the kind that comes after a storm has passed. People lingered, unwilling to break the spell, each of them touched in a way they could not explain. They had come as strangers, but they left bound together by the memory of what they had seen. As the crowd slowly dispersed, the woman remained by the horse's side. She thought of the lessons hidden in this night, of the truths revealed in silence. She realized that sometimes the weakest among us carry the heaviest burdens, and sometimes those we overlook hold the keys to stories that change everything. The horse, though lame and worn, stood tall now, free of its burden. It was no longer just an animal at an auction. It was a messenger, a keeper of memory, a bridge between the past and the present. The woman smiled through her tears, whispering softly, "You are more than they ever saw." The old man, his chest full of letters and his heart full of peace, turned to leave. He paused at the barn door, looking back one last time. His eyes met the horse's and he nodded, a silent thank you for years of loyalty and endurance. Then he stepped out into the night, carrying with him the story that had been hidden too long. The handler stroked the horse's neck, his voice low. "You'll never be forgotten," he said. And he knew it was true. The story would live on, not just in the letters but in the hearts of everyone who had stood in that barn. The auctioneer blew out the lamps one by one, the light dimming until only the stars outside shone. The barn stood quiet again, but it was no longer the same. It had become a place of memory, a place where truth had been uncovered, where a lame horse had entered carrying a secret and left carrying none. In the end, the story was not about an auction at all. It was about the endurance of memory, the weight of secrets, and the strength of a creature dismissed by many but chosen for something far greater. The horse had carried not just a chest, but a legacy. And in doing so, it had reminded them all that even in silence, even in weakness, there can be power. The woman walked out last, her steps slow, her heart full. She glanced back at the horse one final time, the animal standing in the quiet glow of the fading lamps. She knew she would carry this night with her always, a reminder that hidden within the most ordinary places can be stories that bind people together, stories that teach, stories that heal. The wind had stilled, the stars were bright, and the world outside seemed changed. The lame horse had entered the silent auction carrying a secret. It left carrying none. And in that release it had given something priceless to everyone who had witnessed its truth. The lesson lingered in every heart, that sometimes what seems broken carries the strongest stories, and sometimes what seems forgotten is exactly what the world needs to remember.